Welcome, everyone, to the Captive Audience. It is the 22nd of October. We are 2 weeks out from election night. 2 weeks and about 2 hours here on the West Coast from ballot deadline. And we are pleased to be here with one of our somewhat regular guests, Dave Huguenel, who has vast experience both here in Oregon as well as on the national level, both with the Trump 2020 War Room, but also here with a variety of races here in Oregon, as well as the House caucus, both going back 10 years now, but
Right.
also continuing to a degree today. And when we have Dave on, we talk Oregon and we talk national politics. And get the insights we really can't get anywhere else. So welcome to the show, Dave.
Glad to be here, and this feels like a nice capstone to the close to the end of an election cycle. So I've actually been in Oregon 3 times in the last 3 weeks, flown about 18,000 miles, give or take, round trip. So I'll be out there one more time for election night. So
you're going to get yourself a nice vacation off those miles, probably. Huh?
They're racking up fast, so it's not bad.
Well, and so maybe why don't we start out first, since there's always so much to talk about on the national level. Like, what's your perspective on what you see happening here right now in Oregon? Just the heartbeat.
What I see in Oregon is probably a little similar to what I'm seeing nationally. My range of emotions on if things are going to go well or not go well, it kind of oscillates during the cycle. And
every day,
I was very high on Republican prospects in July. It seemed like things like we kind of lost our luster in the fall, through most of August and September. It really feels like October is our month. And one of my favorite political consultants, even though he works on the other aisle, I think he's a really smart guy, is James Carville, a fellow Louisianian like myself.
Yeah,
he was always he kind of put forward the axiom that if a campaign is a war, each day is a battle, right? And whoever wins the most battles wins the war.
Yeah.
So I think in Oregon right now, it just seems like Republicans are winning more battles than Democrats in some of the messaging. And that's got me pretty optimistic for some interesting wins in a couple weeks.
Yeah, and in Oregon, we've been climbing our way back from what at one time was the super minority in the House and the Senate, and last cycle we climbed out of that to where we have like some degree of influence over things because we're not in the super minority, but at the same time, there's been a lot that happened. There was the walkout on the Senate side that led to a lot of folks after the court cases were resolved having to run for other offices and other people run for their positions. And then on the House side, we've got some of the many of the same targeted races we had last time and good candidates. So, but as you said, it's also a messaging battle every day.
Right. No, I think it's from what I've seen from a lot of your candidates out there, they're running for state Senate, state House, even some of the statewide candidates. Well, I guess, you're seeing, well, I should say I'm seeing a real work ethic that you don't see that often. And that's a credit to the candidates that are running. I think they're doing a really good job. I think they're trying really hard. And that counts for something. It's not everything. At the end of the day, spending and messaging matter a lot. But if these are going to be close races, which I have to imagine a few of them will be, that work ethic, that extra few hours each day knocking on doors or calling donors or whatever it is, like it can make a difference.
Yeah, and it really seems like I mean I've been seeing that with Monique Despain in the 4th District. Just incredible work ethic, good team, grassroots, and I know that's what's going on with Lori's campaign as well.
For sure.
That's obviously a highly contested race and one that's been in the headlines and it has national focus on it. We've got the Attorney General's race, of course. That's another big dollar competitive race with ads battling back and forth. You can see it when you watch YouTube and you try to get through one video, and the first one is Dan Rayfield, and you're like, how do I get out of this? And then you go back again, and the next ad is Will Lathrop. And that was in the Eugene area. I'm pretty sure that anybody who's being targeted on digital media in the Portland metro area is seeing probably the same thing in Lori's race, and as well as the AG stuff that's happening. And then we've got Measure 118, which has been both a giant sucking sound for cash, but it's also been a major media battle because it's Oregon trying not to be the stupidest state in the country and implement a corporate tax version of Measure 110, and we've got ranked choice voting on the ballot, which has proven to be one of the worst ideas of all time. So bad that even liberal bastions have gotten rid of it for the most part after they've tried it for a few years, but that has not stopped them from putting it on the statewide ballot here. So we've got a number of battles happening that are real battles on the ballot. But this is good because it's good to know that in the trenches, both in terms of the messaging warfare and in the earned media, but also knocking doors, that everybody is out there fighting for their piece of the territory.
For sure. Yeah, and I think there's going to be a lot to dissect. There always is after the election. What went right, what went wrong, what can we do differently? I think that, again, when I look at Oregon specifically, I just see a lot of things that feel like they're going well and going correctly for Republicans. The other thing that's been interesting too is that typically around this time of year, again, for those who are listening, one of the things that I talk about a lot, if you're a bookie in Vegas and you're trying to set the odds on who's going to win an election, right? Who has the best chance of winning? The easiest probability to go off of is who's spending the most. 75% of the time in American politics, whether you're running for president or you're running for dog catcher, 75% of the time, whoever spends the most money wins. Typically, so to give some context, when I was the executive director of the Oregon House Caucus back in 2016 for the Republicans, we were outspent by about 2-1, maybe a little bit more, maybe closer to 3-1, if I recall. And unsurprisingly, if you go off of that statistic, if I went and showed it to the caucus after the election, if 90% of the time, whoever spent the most money won in Oregon when I bore it out, right? Mm-hmm. So, there were some races where we spent more and we won. There were some races where Democrats spent more and they won. So it was there were only, I think, 2 races, which is why it was 90 and not 100, only 2 legislative races in the entire state where someone spent less but still won, right? It happens, but it's rare. What's interesting about Oregon right now is typically around this time, this is when Democrats really put their foot on the gas in terms of, spending a lot on these legislative races. And it's slower the Democrat spending is slower than what it's been historically. They're typically up on broadcast television by now. They're dropping more mail. They're outpacing on cable and digital. None of that really seems to be happening, at least not to the pace that it has been the last few cycles, which could potentially open up a real opportunity for Republicans to do something special if that remains the case. So that's always something that's super interesting to see. Same thing. If you look at the spending in Oregon's 5th congressional district, if you look at all the outside groups getting involved in that sort of stuff, right now Republicans are outspending Democrats. That's a really good sign there. So there's a lot of reasons to be optimistic. The only reason to not be optimistic is that it is Oregon. Oregon will break your heart if you're a Republican. So, if you sense some skepticism in my voice, which you should, it's always because Oregon is a tough place for Republicans to win. If you live in Oregon, you live behind enemy lines to a certain extent.
Yeah. No, we're guerrilla warfare.
Right. So any win there is a massive win. But I do think that you're going to see some special ones on November 5th.
Well, and I know that even though Oregon is not one of the states that is likely to affect the presidential race, the presidential race does seem to affect Oregon to some extent, at least because of what people pay attention to and what kind of dialogue takes place. But also, just a lot of people are obviously watching that.
Right.
And even though they know that if they cast a vote here, it's this isn't one of the swing states that is up for grabs necessarily in the national picture. How do you think that is affecting Oregon at this point?
Well, it's certainly, I mean, presidential elections, always result in higher turnout. More people, even if you don't live in a swing state, most voters are excited to go vote for president and vote for big ticket items. So you will see high turnout in Oregon because of that. What the devil's always in the details, right? If there's higher turnout, the question is, who are those new people that are showing up to vote that typically don't vote in midterms and things like that. The thing that's interesting to me about Oregon in that regard is that if you look at the 2022 election just 2 years ago, you had historically high turnout amongst Democrat-leaning voters. Single female women, or single females, white females, suburban. Younger voters, folks that vote Democrat, right? Folks that are typically more Republican, white non-college voters, Hispanics, which are becoming more and more of a part of the Republican voting bloc, those turnout numbers were a little bit lower. So what that kind of means is that there's a possibility that this higher turnout that we see in Oregon for the presidential race, even though the presidential race isn't competitive in Oregon, it could potentially mean that there's more Republicans turning out to vote than you saw in the 2022 midterms. Whereas in the 2022 midterms, Democrats kind of spent themselves, basically. Like anyone that could vote that was a Democrat did vote to a certain extent. So again, there's reasons to be optimistic on turnout. Like high turnout is not necessarily a bad thing for a Republican candidate anymore, because we do have certain demographics within our sort of core constituency as a party that are not what we would consider high propensity voters that vote every single year. Sorry, go ahead.
That has definitely been something that has been talked about nationwide, and that's why it could be beneficial here, because those low propensity voters that we used to attribute that to Democrats. Years ago, we used to say if it rains on election day, back when people used to go before vote by mail and in most states, then it would potentially depress Democrat turnout because they tended to be the working class and the lower propensity, less frequent voters that the Democrats built a machine to try and turn out whenever they could.
Right.
That seems to have that we've talked about this many times, that demographic flip that's happened, where it's white college educated women have now become a solid constituency of the Democrat Party, but working class people, particularly men, and now it's starting to include Black males and Hispanics. Those less frequent voters that are leaning Republican now are starting to turn out in this election. Right. And you're saying that can also influence things here in Oregon. I know it can influence things in the 4th district because Oregon's 4th district has a heavy working class dimension to it.
Yeah, even the demographic tectonic plates that are moving in our country that how that kind of determine how people align politically. It affects non-swing states too, just like Oregon, right? It's also one of the reasons that some states are swing states now that historically weren't, right? The reason that Georgia is a swing state on the presidential election is because of a booming college-educated population in the Atlanta metro area.
Yeah.
But one very anecdotal piece of evidence that I have of this, which I thought was fascinating. So I live in Northwest Georgia, about an hour north of Atlanta. So I live in a very, very Republican county, but we have in-person early voting here in Georgia. So I went and early voted in person last week because I typically have to work on election day, so I can't vote at the booth. When I got there, line out the door to early vote, which I'd never seen before. So high turnout for early voting in a Republican area. But what was really fascinating to me was the woman standing in front of me in line. She was talking to a friend of hers. I was able to discern based on their conversation. They were certainly conservative, almost certainly voting for Donald Trump at the top of the ticket. She made a comment that this was her first time voting in over 6 years. So this is someone that didn't vote in 2020, certainly didn't vote in 2022, 2020, or 2018. Maybe voted in 2016, but again, it's possible that she didn't. So the fact that she turned out to vote tells me that, at least in Georgia, but again, it's usually not confined to one state. It's kind of demographic trends that kind of happen nationally. There's a contingent of people that are ready to go vote for Republicans that are turning out to vote that historically don't vote, or at least don't vote that often. So that's
well, I'm pretty sure somebody who hasn't voted in 6 years is not showing up any opinion polling.
That's a very fair point too. That's a very fair point as well. It's one of the reasons that it's really tough to say if any of the polling is accurate. But again, if you take the polling at its word, right, which you kind of should, or at least kind of gauge what's happening based on it. Most of these states, kind of looking nationally, are a bit of a coin flip right now. Pennsylvania is certainly a coin flip. Georgia is kind of a coin flip, but definitely leaning more Trump. In terms of most of the polling, even Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Wisconsin. So if the polling is off just by a point or two, just by a little bit, and folks like this are coming out to vote that historically don't vote, and they're planning to vote Republican, it could make for a very fascinating, and frankly, for a Republican, a very good election night to watch.
I was going to say, because I think that error is skewed in one direction based on everything I've been hearing and reading, which is the voters that are hardest to measure are low propensity voters in your likely voter model. And although there's some concerns, the Democrats, I was hearing, said that they were comfortable with this situation because they'd rather be trying to take a disenchanted, swing state, college educated, suburban Republican and pull them over, than try to win a low propensity, working class, high school educated white somewhere that they can't count on. But then again, that's exactly it. I think the former is easier to measure than the latter if you're doing opinion polling. The other phenomena that I've heard about, I don't know exactly how true it is or if polling has actually managed to calibrate itself around this, is that if there are people who are uncomfortable sharing their point of view with a pollster when they get called, it's a Trump supporter, as opposed to a Kamala Harris supporter, which seemed to be not only not uncomfortable, but in fact more than willing to tell you what they think. And that I don't know if that affects also the ability to detect these folks, even when they get a survey from a pollster. But I'm thinking that I think you're also suggesting is that you're off by a point or two. You're off by a point or two, probably in terms of how you're accounting for who might be voting for President Trump in one of these swing states. And I've been telling people, just based on history, and you pointed this out first on a captive audience probably a couple of years ago, is that President Trump never led in any poll in 2019 or 2020. I also heard recently he didn't lead in any polls in 2016 either.
Right.
And so the history is he's behind, and then the election, then he outperforms the polls, and the election is really close. And in the case of 2016, he won by tens of thousands of votes, several blue wall states. And in 2020, he lost in those states.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. And if I was to argue with myself a little bit, I mean, but so Trump has historically overperformed what the polling says. Now, most pollsters do want to be accurate. Like most
Of course. Yeah.
public pollsters are good actors. They're data scientists, right? So most pollsters have gone back to look like, hey, where did we mess up? Where did we get this wrong? After 2016, they realized the biggest mistake they made is they didn't weight their polls on education. It was clear after 2016 that your education level was a strong determining factor on what political party you're going to support. They never really waited for that before. So they did fix that. But then they saw, so they fixed it in 2020. Polls were a little more accurate, but they were still off. Trump still overperformed. And I think part of that was some of these folks that don't respond to polls coming out, right? So now the 2022 polling for the midterms was actually pretty accurate. Most pollsters kind of got it right, but it's a little bit easier to get your polling correct when turnout's lower. If you have a better sense of who the voting base is going to be, it's easier to predict what's going to happen. So I think it's fair to assume that the polling in 2024 will be more accurate than 2020 and certainly more accurate than 2016. But that's not to say that it's completely accurate. And even if it is accurate, keep in mind, if Trump is only up or down a point or two in some of these states, the margin of error for all of these polls, regardless of how accurate a poll is, there's always going to be a statistical margin of error that's built. Yeah. That's just the nature of the math of statistics. Most of these polls have the margin of error of 4 or 5 points. So being up or down a point is basically means it's kind of anybody's game in terms of who could potentially win that state.
That's why they do a lot of real politics. They look at averages of polls, and then they look, because so many of these polls don't happen all the time. So then they group them, and then they try to look at, is there some momentum or some pattern to filter out the data noise within that plus or minus a margin of error. And I think the one thing that is clear is in the last 30 days, Kamala Harris's sort of bump has not only petered out, but has started to reverse in several states. The one that stood out the most to me was Arizona, where she was winning Hispanics and now she's losing them.
Right.
And then, of course, today, the news that actually she's losing them in a nationwide poll, which is a pretty tough thing to pull off.
Right.
If you're losing Hispanics to President Trump in a nationwide poll, he was at 49%. That means that you're getting a pretty good chunk of Hispanics in New York and California that are voting for you. You might really be underperforming in some other places.
Right. Well, and one of the listeners, Bobby, just asked, what does it mean that, that since Harris wasn't voted on as a candidate and it's still technically, the Biden administration that's on the ballot, kind of paraphrasing, right? Harris has always been in a tough position once she became the nominee. Because on one hand, she is a creature of the Biden administration. She was quite literally handpicked by President Biden, then candidate Biden, to be his vice presidential nominee. She's been vice president for the better part of the last, 3.5 years. So she has to figure out what her own brand and what her own message is. And I think that at least in this last month, I think she's failed to do that. I mean, she's arguably failed to do that the entire time she's been the nominee. But to your point, Kevin, her luster kind of wore off. People are kind of realizing that, there's just not a whole lot of there. The other point, too, is that when voters are deciding who to vote for, there's only really 2 fundamental ways that someone can make their decision. They can either decide to vote based on a referendum of the current administration, or they can vote, as a choice between 2 options. The problem, if you're Kamala Harris, you want this election to be a choice and not a referendum. You want there's 2 different futures set aside, set in front of you. Do you want to go the Kamala Harris way or the Donald Trump way? If that's the mindset of voters when they go in, Kamala has a better chance of winning. The problem for Kamala Harris, and the benefit of most Republicans, and especially Donald Trump on the top of the ticket, is I think most voters are thinking of this election as a referendum. And the question that most voters are trying to answer when they vote is the Biden administration doing a good job? And if that's the question voters are asking themselves, Kamala Harris is in a ton of trouble.
I think that's where most of the weight of the election seems to have settled after the initial
Yes.
Harris came in, right? Aren't the Democrats trying to not only make it a choice, but underpinning the choice? They're trying to make it a referendum on Donald Trump because Joe Biden wasn't in it anymore.
Well, so I would argue that it's been more of a choice, right? It's like, you've got this, your choice for your future is this MAGA extremist or this, moderate Democrat, right? And to be clear, I'm not saying that Kamala is a moderate Democrat. I'm saying that's what she's trying to argue.
Yeah.
Right. That's the choice that they're trying to present. That there's these two different candidates, right? And here are the pros to Kamala. Here are the cons to Trump. The problem that Kamala Harris has with that is that she is of the incumbent party. And frankly, the incumbent party hasn't done a great job. And I'm probably being polite when I put it that way.
Yeah.
The last few years, inflation has gone up, crime has gone up. Our border is just absolutely lawless right now.
Yeah.
Folks, and bottom line is, folks don't feel better off than they did pre-COVID. No one feels like I don't know any of my friends, whether they're a Democrat or a Republican, that say, you know what, life in the United States right now is absolutely perfect. I wouldn't change a thing.
Yeah. Well, and people did kind of feel that way in 2019 to a great extent. I mean, enough people that it certainly would have been an easy re-election. We know COVID changed the rules quite a bit in 2020. Trump today was saying, do you feel better off than you did 4 years ago? And I think most people who are answering that question for themselves felt the same way the crowd did at a Trump rally.
100%. And look, to bring it back to Oregon too, right? Or in Oregon, if your local elections for state house and state senate and county commissioner and all that sort of stuff, if those are referendums in some of these swing areas, like that's pretty good for Republicans, because if you're an Oregonian, you've seen the fatal flaws of Measure 110. You've seen what happens when you have one party rule in that state for the better part of a half century. Things just don't go well. So, you've got, I think you have a lot of voters potentially in Oregon that haven't historically been enthusiastic supporters of Republican candidates. They're like, you know what? This isn't a choice. Like, I have to send a message to the Democrats that what they're doing is not okay. Measure 110 was not okay. That killed people. The higher taxes, the higher cost of living, the lack of housing, the lack of solutions when it comes to illegal immigrants coming into Oregon, the drug and human trafficking, none of this is okay. And if that is what voters feel and how they feel when they are filling out their ballot at their kitchen table in Oregon, again, I think you're going to see some very interesting results for Republican candidates on November 5th.
Well, and I think that to some extent in many of these down ballot races, I don't think it's helping Kamala Harris too much from what I can see, but many of the down ballot races, the Democrats thought that they would run on abortion, and maybe that's been effective in some circumstances. I think they probably have Republicans a bit on defense on that one. Certainly President Trump has actually tried to blunt that with his stances that he's introduced here in the general election. I've seen it certainly in the 4th District and elsewhere. But the Democrats also thought that this big pot of money they had from the Inflation Reduction Act and the Biden infrastructure bill was going to rain money everywhere, and everybody would feel that right now. Mm-hmm. And that's the same money, by the way, that's been helping pump inflation since 2021, at a time when the economy didn't need it, and they actually made things pretty bad. For a year or two, the inflation rate was in historic territory, and we've seen in the 4th District. The Biden infrastructure bill, they call it the bipartisan infrastructure bill, but it's like, bipartisan's a nice label, but it's Biden. and
Yeah.
and this money is being rained down on different communities. But I just don't get the feeling like that by itself is enough to change the fundamentals of what you just said about how people feel in general, the thing they want to send a message about.
Right. Oh, sorry, excuse me. You know, 9:30 on the East Coast, so I apologize if I'm yawning. You're not boring me, Kevin. I'm running on fumes here.
Yeah, no, it just feels like Biden is kind of that money they thought they were going to just pour onto things, and
Right.
it doesn't go fast either, right? All this money, it turns into press releases, but it doesn't turn into people actually doing anything or
Right.
benefiting.
Right.
That's my sense.
No, I think that's absolutely right. You know, and if you are, I think the misstep that Democrats have made with abortion is that it is an effective message for them with a certain demographic of people. That certain demographic is already going to vote Democrat anyway. What it really is, if anything, is it's a motivator for those folks to get out and vote. But I don't know that you are peeling votes away from Republicans with that. I think most voters understand when they go to vote that all things being equal, you know, a Democrat is a pro-choice candidate and a Republican is a pro-life candidate.
Yeah.
You don't have to litigate that on the airwaves for voters to understand that. That's pretty well ingrained in our politics. That's basically been the politics of the United States, you know, since at least the 1990s for the most part, right? We really started to see that separation on that issue. So, you know, that's why I think you've seen a lot of Democratic campaigns have actually come off that issue in the last month because they realized they're not necessarily getting any new voters with it. They might be enthusing some of their existing voters, but at a certain point, you know, if you know all of your voters are showing up, or there's enthusiasm you can make them to get out and vote, at a certain point, you're just preaching to the choir. And I think, you know, the more the Democrats talk about that issue in this late phase of the campaign, they're really just preaching to the choir. So, you know, there's still some messaging to be done in these final weeks. I mean, Oregon is always a unique place to message because if I remember correctly, by the end of this week, I think as much as 50% of the state may have already voted.
By the weekend, I think after this weekend,
yeah.
because I think the other half, it's kind of like the first two-thirds of the vote by mail period.
Yeah,
is 50% of the vote, and then the last 50% comes in from a lot of people who just put it off, or you know, it's like doing their taxes, or they're undecided. We got a bunch of measures on the ballot that require a lot of research for anybody who actually wants to figure it out. So that's creating some procrastination too, as it would happen.
Right. Well, and someone asked how I think this election will go. You know, what I like to say is I have no clue, but that's a boring answer. So I'll pretend I'll be like a political pundit, and I'll pretend like I know the answer.
Yeah.
So, you know, I was always taught by one of my favorite college professors when I took political science. You know, he always said, David, you know, never predict, only project. So if I had to project, you know, what's the likelihood of Republicans winning, right? Whether it be for president or for some of your local races in Oregon, I think the best I can say right now is that I probably lean more towards Republicans winning now than I have for the better part of the past year. Like if I had to make a choice, who is the most likely to win overall? You know, Republicans seem to have the ball at the moment.
That does seem to be right. I do think that we've seen in the last couple of weeks a pretty noticeable shift of momentum towards Trump in the swing states. The only state that I think has been consistently sort of a toss-up has been Wisconsin. The others, you see kind of every once in a while shows Trump actually in the lead, and then the next day the poll shows it dead even. The next day it shows Kamala Harris up by one. The only one that showed her kind of still eking something out, I think, is Wisconsin. Michigan, I'm surprised is competitive, actually. they must be really losing black males in that state, and they must also be losing Arab voters who are unhappy with what's been going on in the Middle East. And then on top of that, you just got the EV thing, which is just super stupid that they push that so hard, because that has caused the rank and file of these unions, the private sector, have abandoned the leadership in nearly every major union across the country, and they can't even bring themselves to issue an endorsement, which normally would have been a slam dunk for Democrats.
No, again, I think what you just pointed out, Kevin, that's another example of these sort of tectonic. When I think of, demographics deciding what party they're going to support, it doesn't move quickly. It's like tectonic shifts, right? But every now and then you feel an earthquake, right? Just like when the tectonic plates move. In 2016, that was an earthquake. The tectonic plates were moving before then, slowly. They started to move a little
quicker. They shifted, and then everybody felt it.
Exactly. What you're seeing now in the private sector trades is maybe a little bit of an earthquake, right? I mean, the fact that you had the Teamsters speak at the Republican National Convention back over the summer, that's no small thing. That's a big deal. To your point, a lot of the rank and file members of these private sector trade unions are supporting Republicans. That's kind of been the case, and it's been growing over the last decade.
Yeah.
What you're really starting to see more is the leadership for these private sector trades putting their support behind Republican candidates.
Yeah.
Something I saw in New Jersey when I worked for Chris Christie in 2013. It's something that I've seen some with Donald Trump. He's got a historically good relationship with private sector trade unions. Frankly, you're even seeing it with Lori in Oregon's 5th congressional district. She's gotten a ton of support from private sector trades because of her work on the Hill. That is something that if you're a Republican thinking about running for office, or you are running for office, don't sleep on private sector trades. They are a part of what the new coalition to win as a Republican is going to be.
Yeah. And the other phenomena that I thought was very noticeable in many of these swing state races nationally are Democrats, particularly in the Senate. You've probably seen and heard about this, where you got John Tester, Bob Casey, and then in Ohio, a red state where there's a Democrat senator running for election, Sherrod Brown. Those are the ones that stand out to me the most, where they're actually trying to talk in their TV commercials of how they worked. They stood up to President Biden, and they worked with President Trump to do something. That is not something you're seeing a lot of Republicans saying right now. Even in races where you might need to attract some Democrat votes, it doesn't seem to be the thing is to talk about how you worked with Joe Biden to accomplish anything.
Right.
Especially if he hasn't really accomplished much of anything.
No, 100%. And you're seeing it in Oregon, too, where Democrats are trying to claim bipartisanship and all that sort of stuff. I mean, for Democrats in Oregon to do that, when you're the party in control and you're trying to claim that you work bipartisanly, I don't know if that's a word or not, but I just made it up. There's it's almost an admission of guilt. It's like, we run everything, but it sucks, which is why I work with a Republican every now and then.
Yeah.
That's something that I think is super telling. And frankly, you've seen it in Oregon specifically on the Measure 110 recriminalization.
Right? Yeah.
And I say recriminalization, italicized, bolded, underlined, and in air quotes.
Because it's Measure 110 light is what
it is. It is. And Democrats are taking a victory lap on it because, frankly, some I want to be careful, but some interesting local consultants in your state, thought it was a good idea to do that. And convinced Republicans and took them for a ride.
They did. And that's Dan Rayfield's entire campaign is his claim to be the kind of guy that is bipartisan and trying to get things fixed, even though he was part of the problem. in enabling the entire thing in the first place. Then he just made himself part of the solution. He's trying to claim that he's, as you said, bipartisan.
Right. No, it was definitely strategic advice that was in retrospect. Well, not retrospect for some of us because we warned them, but it was a major mistake by a couple of, well, really just one political consultant in particular that ran with it, and that's why that particular person is going to probably be the only person that really loses anything this year because he just doesn't know how to win a race.
Well, and the other phenomena that I'm confused about, maybe you have more insight, right? Is so there's 3 states that I'm wondering about. Why is North Carolina even still considered competitive? I gotta believe that the way that entire disaster was handled looks bad, because it was like Biden's Katrina, except I'm not sure that it's even being portrayed that way. And then we've got a close Senate race supposedly in Florida with Rick Scott, and a close Senate race in Texas with Ted Cruz. What's going on there? I just can't even really watch it that closely.
Well, I mean, my take on North Carolina, there's a few states unpacked there, but starting with North Carolina, I personally see North Carolina as the least competitive of the competitive states.
I agree.
Right. All things being equal, that should be a state that Republicans win. Part of the issue that you have in North Carolina, though, is you do have some demographic changes there. You have a lot of people moving from the Northeast into the Charlotte and Raleigh area.
Some of the same stuff that affected Georgia.
Yeah, some of the same stuff that affected Georgia, right? Similar issues. Also, you've got I'll just say it. You have a bad candidate running for governor on the Republican side. He has been plagued with scandal after scandal. His entire team left him. That is a race that, you have, the Democrats will win the governorship in North Carolina. And so you do have to have some split ticket voting. You're going to have folks, if you're Trump, in order to win, you have to have folks that are voting for the Democrat for governor that are voting you for president. Split ticket voting is not something that's terribly common anymore in our politics. So
and when something encourages it, it kind of breaks things up. It breaks some things loose potentially, right?
Right. It's generally speaking, if the top of your ticket in the state, has a major scandal that involves, accounts on pornographic websites, it does make it a little more difficult to win there.
Yeah.
All things being equal. So, that said, I'm not going to be biting my fingernails when North Carolina closes, at least not for the presidential election.
And we won it the last 2 times.
We have. But, again, Obama did win it, I think, in 2008 or 12. He won it one of those times. I think
2008.
Might have been 2008. I think you're right. So it is a state that Democrats can, at least in theory, win. And the demographics are changing to their benefit. Now, Texas, similar type of issue. The biggest, we talk about illegal immigration, and the millions of migrants that are coming over the border. The real big population shift in Texas, though, are people from California that are moving to Texas.
Yeah.
And so, again, you have the same issue. If you have a bunch of educated, college-educated white voters, those are folks that 8 times out of 10 are going to vote Democrat. That population is increasing pretty rapidly. And while Republicans are doing better with Hispanics now than we ever historically have, we're not winning the vast majority of them. We're not even winning the majority of them in some cases. But we're winning. Instead of winning 20%, we're winning 30%, which is great. But the issue is that where the Republican base in Texas, while it's growing, is it growing fast enough to deal with the influx of liberal Californians that are moving in? Those are kind of the 2 forces that are pushing against each other.
That's amazing that hundreds of thousands of Californians move from California to Texas because they can't stand California anymore, and they love Texas so much they want to turn it into California.
It is. I don't have a good explanation for that. But yeah, no, it's. I have some friends that live in Texas. They are not a huge fan of that. Frankly, same thing in Oregon. You see, I would argue, because you've had a lot of folks move to Oregon from California, if you didn't have like that California migration coming in, because there's a lot of parts of Oregon that have been turning more conservative. East Multnomah County is one. The coast of Oregon has become
Yep.
one, right? If you didn't have those folks moving in, Oregon could very potentially be a swing state. Like we would at least talk about it the same way that we talk about like a Minnesota or a Michigan, I think.
Yeah.
So that's, it's just these dang Californians, man. They just make all these races like super competitive.
Yeah. Fleeing the place that was a mess.
They're a liberal hive.
Yeah. So, Florida, Rick Scott, that was the only other one I mentioned.
Yeah. I think, I'm not personally working on anything in Florida. It's probably the state I've paid the least attention to. But I think the impacts of the hurricanes, just the nature of the fact that Republicans kind of run everything down there, right? The same sort of issue. If voters in Florida are unhappy and they want to punish somebody, they can only punish the Republicans that are at the top of the ticket, which that obviously points to Rick Scott. I think the other thing too, though, is Democrats have, at least nationally for these Senate and House races, significantly outraised Republicans. So Democrats, because of their massive war chest, are able to make places more competitive than they should be.
Yeah.
So I think that's especially true with Texas and Florida.
Yeah.
Again, all things being equal, I don't know that I see any major surprises in either of those states come election night, but it's certainly not outside the realm of possibility.
Well, and Georgia was affected by that same war chest stuff. You've got 2 Democrat senators, and in part because there was just a massive influx of funds. Now they got that system right where you have a runoff sometimes after the original election day. Then you have another election day in December, and when the Senate's at stake, tens of millions of dollars can come in for that, right? Ossoff and what's his name?
Warnock.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's just, it's the exact same thing. And the other thing too is, like you mentioned, some of these other states where Democrats are struggling on the U.S. Senate races. I think most Democrats are expecting to lose those seats, and which means that if they lose those, then Republicans gain control of the U.S. Senate, right? So what Democrats have to try to do, and again, this is kind of the chess game of politics when you're looking at these maps. It's like, well, if we're going to lose these, then we have to find something else to pick up if we want to retain our majority. So you kind of have to look like, okay, well, I'm not saying these are the best shots for us if I'm a Democrat, but Texas, Florida, those are the next potential ones we could try to play in and make competitive. So there's a little bit of that as well. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out.
Well, I know it's getting late there, and by the way, the media. I don't know if you've developed any opinions about the media. It really was interesting what happened with Kamala Harris and Maria Shriver at this, what she admitted was a fake town hall when she said we're only taking, prescribed questions from somebody who wanted to just ask a question at a town hall. And it's like, no, you're not one of the lists of questions we already had planned.
Right.
But maybe I will ask what you're thinking. And it's like, that's not a town hall.
No, Kevin, I'll say this. I think the media does astounding work. I don't think they're ever wrong. I don't think there's a single bone of bias in their body. They always tell the truth. They're a fantastic group of people. They all deserve Nobel Prizes.
Yeah, but not Pulitzers,
No, I'm kidding. They're most of the mainstream media. I think they are more partisan now, in my opinion, than ever in my career. There is a time where I do remember the media being good at calling balls and strikes. And frankly, our country needs that. I think that, the reality is, like, look, I'm a political media consultant. My job is to put forth, for all intents and purposes, propaganda on behalf of my clients. I am not calling balls and strikes. I'm telling you everything that is great about my client. Democrats do the same thing. They are going to say everything that is great about their client. And then we're going to attack each other. I'm going to say, this is why Democrats suck. And Democrats are going to say the same thing about us. A good media ecosphere serves as a referee in that sort of football match between the two parties and the two candidates. And it helps voters understand, where I or my counterpart on the other side of the aisle may go too far, right? And they throw a flag on, like, hey, nope, that's too much. That's actually incorrect. That's
Yeah.
that is
check and balance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wish we had more of that. But unfortunately, that's just not where we're at now. Media, for a lot of different reasons, and I think most of it's revolved around money and their business model. They have found that it is much more profitable to put their fingers on the scale when they report, as opposed to, being honest arbiters of truth. And that, to me, is honestly one of the most heartbreaking things, because there are good reporters out there, but they are very, very, very hard to find.
Yeah, we've accidentally stumbled across a couple of journalists in the 4th District. And then there's others who I would just put into a category of not courageous when an obvious lie exists. You should ask about it. But there's just a lot of, why don't you tell us about your campaign? And just head nodding, and that's a disservice, because the media serves no purpose whatsoever if they don't do this check and balance thing. Otherwise,
right,
they're just staged airtime, which is why actually running an ad works better, because at least you can control the entire message. I've seen some journalists say, if you really want that point to be made, that something is false, then you're going to have to run that in an ad. And I'm like, so what's your job? What's your job? What are you doing for a living out there? You just, consuming oxygen in front of people on TV. But the stuff that comes up now that bombards people on the presidential race, as well as many of these other higher profile races, I recognize them. They're not news articles. They're ads. Like when we take a picture of somebody and it makes them like, and then you take another picture of somebody and it's like hopeful, that, and you do that, but you take the headline and it sounds just like the thing we would say on a mail piece, and you take the picture and you put the picture there to make them look either stupid or in trouble or super confident if they're your person, and then you just shove it out there, and then there's no substance to it. It's not like we write dissertations on mail pieces. Right. But this is what journalism seems to be turning into.
Yeah. And again, I think I want to be clear. I don't want to paint with too broad of a brush. I do think that there are good actors. I think there are folks that try to be good journalists. But I don't think that they're the majority. I think they're a slim minority of folks.
Yeah. Yeah, they are.
And I wish that we had a culture in journalism that did a better job of rewarding, that sort of referee mentality as a journalist. Your job is to put your personal partisanship aside, and really just call the balls and strikes as you see them. And I don't know how to get back to that, but I do hope that that's something that we get closer to in the future.
It would be great, because to be more discerning would actually, I personally believe that if people they think for themselves, they reach a lot of Republican conclusions most of the time. And so I just encourage people to think for themselves. I say, I'm not going to tell you what to do or what to think, but if you think for yourself and I give you, here's the information that you could use, they reach the conclusion. But if they go for the adrenaline and serotonin hits of the ad headlines that hit them with the picture that they don't read the substance of,
right?
The news stories, then actually it does. They just react emotionally to stuff. Because you've probably encountered somebody that has a severe case of Trump derangement syndrome, and I found 9 times out of 10 they're completely misinformed.
Right.
Not informed, and then they've reached a conclusion. They've been told an enormous amount of stuff, and there's people still walking around that believe the entire thing in Charlottesville is exactly the way it was portrayed in 2020. which is crazy, but we do need those referees. Anyway, I know it's late there, but we want to thank you for taking the time to talk. Always great to have you on. This might be the last time we get to talk, obviously before Election Day, but
hopefully I'll see you when I'm out there.
Yeah, that would be great. And I can tell you that it's going to be a historic day, whatever happens, assuming that we know results on Election Day, which, you know,
I can certainly project someone's going to win this election.
Someone's going to win this election.
Yeah.
And I also think that if it goes the way I actually think it might be drifting right now, there's going to be some pretty violent people around the country, is my guess.
It's unfortunate, but you're probably not wrong. But yeah, it was. Thanks for everyone listening to the show. This has always been always a lot of fun to be on here, and the only place where I'm okay saying "Go Ducks."
That's right. Yeah, they're number one. So
for now, you guys do a good job of being number one. In the middle of the season, what matters is being number one at the end of the season, which you guys don't.
You have to face the SEC and not some wimpy Big Ten opponent, right?
We'll be waiting for you.
Okay, there you go. Well, thanks a lot, Dave, and God bless, and keep up the great work there. I know that's what you're doing, and we all appreciate it.
Yep. Y'all have a good night.
Thanks everyone for watching. Share this show with everyone you can, and we will see you on the next episode of The Captive Audience tomorrow night. Sonny and Dave, and Sonny and Don. Sorry, we've got Dave here. Sonny and Don will be on tomorrow night, and we will cover more